The police precinct parking lot buzzed under the late afternoon sun. Officer Mark Reynolds, known for his brash attitude and unchecked arrogance, strutted toward his cruiser with a cup of coffee in hand. Dressed in a spotless uniform, his every move radiated an air of self-importance. Nearby, a black man in a sharp suit stood leaning against a car, scrolling through his phone. "Hey, you can't just loiter here," Reynolds barked, his tone sharp and accusing. The man glanced up, his calm demeanor contrasting with Reynolds' rising hostility. "I'm not loitering," the man replied evenly, slipping his phone into his pocket. "I have every right to be here." Reynolds stepped closer, his posture stiff with authority. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. Move it along now." The man didn't flinch. "I'm waiting for someone." That was all it took to set Reynolds off. His ego demanded submission, and the man's calm defiance felt like a direct affront. Without warning, Reynolds spit on him, the act dripping with contempt. "Get out of here before I arrest you," Reynolds sneered, his words laced with venom. The world seemed to pause. A hush fell over the parking lot as the man slowly raised his hand to wipe the spit off his face. The tension was palpable, every onlooker holding their breath. Then, with a chilling calmness, the man spoke. "Officer Reynolds, is that how you treat everyone, or just the people you think are beneath you?" Reynolds froze. Something in the man's voice shifted the balance of power. Before Reynolds could respond, the station doors swung open. A group of senior officers poured out, their faces lighting up in recognition. "There you are, Chief Thompson," one called out, hurrying over to shake the man's hand. "We've been waiting for you." Reynolds' face drained of color. The black man he'd just spit on, humiliated in public, wasn't some random civilian. He was the new police chief. Chief Thompson's piercing gaze locked on Reynolds. "We'll talk inside, officer. I trust your superiors have informed you of today's leadership changes." The onlookers exchanged stunned glances as Reynolds stammered, his bravado crumbling. The humiliation was unbearable, but the worst was yet to come. What would you have done in this situation? Have you ever seen something like this happen? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe our channel. Stay tuned, this is just the beginning. The silence inside the precinct conference room was oppressive. Officer Reynolds sat stiffly in a chair, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, unable to meet the intense stare of Chief Thompson, who now stood at the head of the room. The atmosphere carried the weight of a reckoning. Reynolds' mind raced, trying to piece together how his casual arrogance had landed him in this position. Chief Thompson's expression was unreadable, his sharp eyes flickering over Reynolds and the small group of senior officers who had assembled. Behind him, the precinct's mission statement hung on the wall, to protect and serve with honor and integrity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Thompson broke the silence. "Officer Reynolds," he began, his voice steady but commanding, "do you know why I asked to meet with you immediately?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "Sir, You don't," Thompson interrupted, his tone now as sharp as a blade. "Because if you did, we wouldn't be here." The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Everyone had heard the story by now, how Reynolds had spat on the new chief in a display of unprovoked hostility. No one wanted to be in Reynolds' shoes. Thompson took a slow step forward, placing his hands on the table and leaning in. "I want you to recount, in your own words, what happened in the parking lot." Reynolds hesitated, searching for a way to spin the situation in his favor. "Sir, I didn't know who you were. I thought." "You thought what?" Thompson cut in, his voice rising slightly. "You thought it was acceptable to humiliate and assault a man simply because of the color of his skin? Because he didn't immediately comply with your baseless orders?" Reynolds' face flushed red. "No, sir, I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it, then?" Thompson's question was razor-sharp, leaving no room for escape. The room grew heavier with each passing second. One of the senior officers, Captain Harris, finally spoke up. "Chief Thompson, if I may, Officer Reynolds has been with the precinct for 5 years. He's been known to have a strong personality, but—" Thompson straightened and turned to Harris, his expression hardening. "Captain, this isn't about personality. It's about behavior. Behavior that reflects not just on the individual but on the entire department. And what I witnessed today is unacceptable, period. Harris nodded quickly, retreating into silence. Thompson returned his attention to Reynolds, his tone quieter but no less firm. Let me tell you something about me, officer. I didn't get here by luck. I've faced men like you my entire career. Men who judge, belittle, and abuse their authority without a second thought. But let me make one thing very clear. This stops today. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sir, I apologize for my actions. I wasn't thinking. That much is obvious, Thompson replied curtly. He paced the room, his presence commanding. But this isn't just about me. It's about the community you've sworn to protect. Do you think they trust officers like you, Reynolds? Do you think a man who spits on another human being deserves the badge he wears? Reynolds looked down, unable to respond. Thompson let the silence linger before speaking again. This precinct has a long way to go, and I intend to see it through. Starting now, every officer will undergo mandatory training on bias, community relations, and the principles of respect and equity. And you, Reynolds, you'll face disciplinary action. Reynolds' head shot up. Disciplinary action, sir? Thompson's gaze was unyielding. What did you expect? A slap on the wrist. You assaulted a superior officer, disrespected the values of this department, and reinforced every negative stereotype people fear about law enforcement. You're lucky I'm not filing criminal charges. Reynolds' jaw tightened, but he said nothing. As Thompson moved toward the door, he paused and turned back. You'll report to Internal Affairs first thing tomorrow morning. And Reynolds, I'll be watching you. With that, Thompson left the room, leaving Reynolds and the senior officers in a stunned silence. Outside, the precinct buzzed with activity, unaware of the seismic shift that had just begun within its walls. Chief Thompson strode through the hallways, his presence commanding respect. But as he glanced at the officers he passed, he knew that today's confrontation was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Racism wasn't just a personal issue, it was systemic. And to root it out, he would have to dig deeper than most were willing to go. The next morning, the precinct was buzzing with whispers. Officer Reynolds sat in a corner of the break room, staring into a lukewarm cup of coffee. His mind replayed the events of the previous day on an endless loop. Everyone knew what had happened, and while most avoided him, the side glances and hushed conversations spoke volumes. Across the hall, Chief Thompson was settling into his new office. The space was sterile, with bland walls and an empty desk, but Thompson didn't care about the decor. His focus was on the files in front of him, personnel records, complaints, and incident reports from the past 5 years. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that Reynolds' behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a troubling pattern within the department. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. He had seen this before, a culture of complacency, where officers like Reynolds were allowed to operate unchecked because no one wanted to stir the pot. But Thompson wasn't here to maintain the status quo. He was here to change it, even if it meant making enemies. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Captain Harris stepped in, his face tight with tension. "Chief, do you have a moment?" Harris asked. "Come in," Thompson replied, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Harris sat down, hesitating before speaking. "Sir, I wanted to talk about Officer Reynolds. I understand your frustration with his behavior, but he's not the only one. There are other officers here who share similar attitudes." Thompson nodded. "I've already noticed. And that's exactly why this department needs change." Harris sighed. "I won't disagree, but you should know this precinct has a history. There's a group of officers, Reynolds included, who formed, let's call it an old guard. They're resistant to new leadership and see themselves as untouchable. You'll face pushback." Thompson leaned forward, his eyes locking with Harris's. "Pushback doesn't scare me, Captain. I've dealt with worse. What I care about is whether you're ready to stand with me or if you're part of the problem." Harris straightened in his chair. "I've been here a long time, Chief. I've seen things I didn't agree with, but I didn't always speak up. Maybe I should have. If you're serious about cleaning up this department, then you'll have my support." Thompson nodded. "Good. Then let's start by addressing the complaints against Reynolds. I've reviewed his record. 3 excessive force allegations, 2 complaints about discriminatory language, and countless incidents that were quietly swept under the rug. That ends now. Harris frowned. I'll admit, Reynolds has a reputation, but the union. The union doesn't scare me either, Thompson interrupted. I'll follow the rules, but I won't compromise on accountability. If Reynolds is the face of this old guard, then it's time for him to face the consequences. Meanwhile, Reynolds was summoned to internal affairs. The small, windowless room felt suffocating, and the presence of IA investigator Rachel Morgan only added to his discomfort. Morgan was sharp, methodical, and known for her no-nonsense approach. Officer Reynolds, she began, sliding a file across the table, we've received reports about yesterday's incident, as well as several complaints from your time on the force. Let's go over them. Reynolds shifted in his seat. I've already apologized for yesterday. It was a mistake. Morgan's expression didn't change. Yesterday's incident wasn't a mistake, it was a symptom of a larger issue. These complaints suggest a pattern of behavior that's inconsistent with the values of this department. Care to explain? Reynolds clenched his fists under the table. People are too sensitive these days. A cop can't do his job without someone taking offense. Morgan raised an eyebrow. Is that how you see it? Because the community sees it differently. And now, with Chief Thompson in charge, this department will be held to a higher standard. If you can't meet that standard, your days here are numbered. Reynolds glared at her but said nothing. Later that day, Thompson held a department-wide meeting. The officers gathered in the briefing room, some curious, others skeptical. Thompson stood at the front, his presence commanding the room. Yesterday, he began, I experienced something I've spent my entire career fighting against. And I won't tolerate it. Not here, not under my watch. The room was silent. I'm aware that change won't come easily, Thompson continued. But this department has a duty to serve every member of our community with respect and integrity. If you can't uphold those values, you don't belong here. The tension in the room was palpable. Thompson's words were a direct challenge to the unspoken culture that had festered for years. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded in agreement. Starting next week, Thompson said, we'll be implementing mandatory training programs to address bias, de-escalation tactics, and community engagement. These aren't optional. If you have a problem with that, my door is always open. But let me be clear, change is coming, and it starts now. As the meeting adjourned, Thompson watched the officers file out, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and defiance. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for the fight. The camera pans to Reynolds, standing in the corner of the room, his jaw tight and his fists clenched. He watches Thompson with a look of simmering resentment. In his mind, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The whispers in the precinct turned into quiet rebellion. Officer Reynolds and his allies from the so-called Old Guard began meeting after hours, gathering in the dark corners of diners or the privacy of their homes. What had started as grumbling complaints about Chief Thompson's leadership quickly escalated into something more organized and dangerous. This training is a joke, Reynolds said, slamming his beer down on the table at their latest meeting. Around him, a half-dozen officers nodded in agreement. Thompson's not here to lead. He's here to humiliate us. One officer, a stocky man with graying hair named Daniels, leaned forward. You think he's trying to make an example out of you? Reynolds sneered. It's obvious. He wants to make me the poster boy for his so-called reforms. He doesn't care about us or this department, just his agenda. Daniels nodded, his expression grim. I've seen this before. They bring in an outsider to fix things, but all they do is tear apart what's working. Another officer chimed in, it's not just the training. Did you hear he started reviewing body cam footage from old cases? He's looking for dirt. Reynolds' jaw clenched. He's trying to clean house. Well, two can play that game. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They all understood the implications of what Reynolds was suggesting but didn't voice their concerns. Instead, they nodded, their silence signaling complicity. Meanwhile, Chief Thompson was working late in his office. The files and footage in front of him painted a grim picture. Complaints about excessive force, racial profiling, and a lack of accountability had piled up over the years, most of them ignored or dismissed. It was worse than he'd anticipated. As he reviewed the latest batch of body cam footage, a knock at the door startled him. Captain Harris entered, his face lined with exhaustion. "Chief, you've stirred the hornet's nest," Harris said, closing the door behind him. "Reynolds and his crew are digging in. They're not happy about the changes." Thompson didn't look up. "I didn't come here to make friends, Captain. I came here to fix what's broken." "I get that," Harris said, pulling up a chair. "But you need to tread carefully. Reynolds is reckless, but he's also influential. A lot of officers respect him, whether we like it or not." Thompson finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Respect him for what? Harassing civilians? Abusing his power? That's not respect, that's fear." Harris hesitated. "Maybe. But fear can be a powerful motivator. If you push too hard, too fast, you could face a mutiny." Thompson leaned back in his chair, considering Harris's words. "I'm not afraid of mutiny, Captain. What I'm afraid of is losing the trust of the community. If we don't change, we're not just failing ourselves, we're failing the people we're sworn to protect." Harris nodded, though his concern lingered. "Just be careful. Reynolds isn't the type to go down quietly." The following week, mandatory bias training began. The session was led by an external consultant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Carmen Rivers. She didn't sugarcoat her presentation, diving straight into hard truths about systemic racism, implicit bias, and the role of law enforcement in perpetuating inequality. As she spoke, Reynolds sat at the back of the room, arms crossed and eyes rolling at every slide. His disdain was palpable, and it didn't go unnoticed. "Officer Reynolds," Dr. Rivers said, her tone sharp, "you seem to have a lot on your mind. Care to share?" Reynolds smirked. "Yeah, I do. I think this whole thing is a waste of time. I don't need some outsider telling me how to do my job." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, but Dr. Rivers didn't flinch. "That attitude, officer, is exactly why we're here. This training isn't about pointing fingers, it's about recognizing blind spots and building trust with the community. If you don't see the value in that, maybe you're in the wrong profession." The room went silent. Thompson, who had been observing from the back, stepped forward. "Dr. Rivers is right. This isn't optional. If you can't take this seriously, you're welcome to leave, but you'd better be prepared to turn in your badge on the way out." Reynolds glared at Thompson but stayed seated. The tension was thick, but the message was clear. The old ways were no longer tolerated. Later that evening, Thompson was driving home when he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror, following a little too closely. He frowned but dismissed it as coincidence. However, as he turned onto his quiet suburban street, the car behind him did the same. Pulling into his driveway, Thompson stepped out of his vehicle and turned to face the car. It slowed as it passed, the driver's face obscured by shadows. But as it disappeared down the street, Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the encounter felt off. He shook his head, dismissing his unease. "Paranoia," he muttered to himself. But deep down, he knew Reynolds wasn't the type to take his humiliation lying down. Back at the precinct, Reynolds and his group met again. This time, their conversation took a darker turn. "He's pushing too far," Reynolds growled. "If he keeps this up, he's going to ruin everything we've worked for." Daniels frowned. "So, what do you suggest?" "We can't exactly kick him out." Reynolds' eyes glinted with something dangerous. "No, but we can make him regret coming here." Daniels shifted uneasily. "Reynolds, you're talking crazy. If this gets out..." "It won't get out," Reynolds snapped. "You just have to trust me." The group exchanged uneasy glances but didn't protest further. The line between defiance and insubordination was thinning, and Reynolds was more than willing to cross it. Chief Thompson sat in his living room, a glass of water in hand, his thoughts racing. He had fought battles like this before, but something about Reynolds felt different. More personal, more dangerous. The camera pans to the window, where the faint outline of a car lingers in the shadows. Thompson doesn't notice, but the audience does. The battle for the precinct and Thompson's safety was far from over. The tension within the precinct was no longer subtle. Conversations halted when Chief Thompson entered a room, and the air bristled with unspoken conflict. The divide between officers who supported his reforms and those loyal to Reynolds grew wider by the day. Thompson had seen this before in other departments, but here, the stakes felt higher. This wasn't just about changing a culture, it was about survival. Late one evening, Thompson was leaving the precinct after another grueling day. As he stepped into the parking lot, the hair on the back of his neck prickled. He glanced around but saw nothing unusual. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. Shaking his head, he approached his car and unlocked it. Just as he opened the door, he noticed something out of place, a crumpled piece of paper stuck under his windshield wiper. He pulled it out and unfolded it under the dim streetlight. The note was short, scrawled in bold, jagged handwriting, "You don't belong here. Leave while you still can." Thompson's jaw tightened. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, his expression unreadable. This wasn't the first time he'd faced threats, but the timing felt different. He knew Reynolds was behind it, or at least involved, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Inside the precinct, Reynolds sat in the break room with Daniels and two other officers, his face twisted in frustration. The training sessions had become unbearable for him. Thompson's presence, coupled with Dr. Rivers' blunt teaching style, felt like a constant attack on everything he believed in. "We've got to do something," Reynolds said, his voice low but urgent. "This guy's turning the whole department against us." One of the younger officers hesitated. "What do you mean by do something? You're not talking about anything illegal, right?" Reynolds scoffed. "Illegal? No. But we need to make it clear that he's not welcome here. He's the one tearing this place apart, not us." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "This is getting dangerous, Mark." "That note." Reynolds shot him a sharp look. The note was just a warning. "If he's smart, he'll take the hint. And if he doesn't?" Daniels asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds didn't answer. The silence spoke louder than words. The following day, Thompson called an emergency meeting with Captain Harris and Internal Affairs investigator Rachel Morgan. He placed the threatening note on the table in front of them. "This was left on my car last night," Thompson said, his tone measured but firm. "I'm certain Reynolds and his group are behind it." Morgan picked up the note, examining it closely. "It's vague, but definitely a threat. Any cameras in the parking lot?" Thompson shook his head. "None that would have caught this." "Convenient, isn't it?" Captain Harris rubbed his temples. "Chief, this is escalating. If Reynolds feels cornered, there's no telling what he might do." "I'm not backing down," Thompson replied. "If anything, this proves we're on the right track. But we need to act carefully. I want Internal Affairs to dig deeper into Reynolds and his associates. We need to uncover more than just rumors if we're going to take decisive action." Morgan nodded. "Understood. I'll start pulling reports and interviewing officers. If there's dirt, I'll find it." Later that afternoon, Thompson addressed the entire department. He stood in the briefing room, his posture confident despite the growing unease in the room. "I'm aware of the tension in this precinct," he began, his voice steady. "I know some of you feel threatened by the changes I'm implementing. But let me be clear, these changes are not optional. They're necessary." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I've received a threat. A cowardly, anonymous note meant to intimidate me. If you think that's going to stop me, you don't know me very well." His gaze swept over the room, lingering briefly on Reynolds, who sat in the back with his arms crossed. Reynolds met his gaze with a smirk, but Thompson didn't flinch. "I became a cop to serve and protect everyone, not just a select few. If you can't uphold that same principle, then you don't belong here. And if you're involved in this threat, or if you're thinking about escalating it further, know that I will find out, and there will be consequences." The room was silent. Thompson's words landed with the weight of a hammer. For a moment, it seemed as though no one would speak. Then, Officer Martinez, one of the younger recruits, raised his hand. "Chief, I just want to say I appreciate what you're doing," Martinez said, his voice clear. "It's about time someone stood up for the right thing." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, but Reynolds and his group remained stone-faced. That night, as Thompson drove home, his mind raced with thoughts about the day. He was making progress, but the resistance was growing stronger. He glanced in his rearview mirror and noticed headlights behind him again. His pulse quickened as the car followed him onto his street. He pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, his eyes fixed on the car as it slowed in front of his house. This time, it didn't drive off. Instead, the driver rolled down the window just enough to toss something onto his lawn before speeding away. Thompson got out of his car, his eyes scanning the dark street. He approached the object on his lawn cautiously. It was another note, but this time it was wrapped around a rock. Unfolding it, he read the words, "Last warning. Leave, or you'll regret it." Thompson's face hardened. He walked back to his house and locked the door behind him. He placed the note and the rock on his kitchen counter, his resolve steeling. This wasn't just about him anymore. The threats were escalating, and the danger was becoming more real. But Thompson wasn't going anywhere. Do you think Chief Thompson is doing the right thing by staying, or should he consider his safety and step down? Let us know in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe as things are about to get even more intense. The precinct buzzed with tension the following morning. Chief Thompson arrived early, carrying the rock and the second note in a sealed evidence bag. He went straight to Rachel Morgan in Internal Affairs. "This was left on my lawn last night," Thompson said, placing the evidence bag on her desk. His voice was calm, but the fire in his eyes betrayed his anger. Morgan picked up the bag, examining the note. "They're escalating," she said, her tone grim. "This isn't just intimidation anymore, it's a direct threat." Thompson nodded. "I need to know who's behind this, Rachel. I don't care what it takes. Pull records, review body cam footage, interrogate Reynolds and his cronies. If they're bold enough to threaten me, they're a danger to the entire community." Morgan nodded. "I've already started digging. If there's a connection, I'll find it." "But, Chief," she hesitated, then added, "be careful. These threats aren't just posturing anymore. They mean business." Across town, Reynolds was holding another meeting with his inner circle in the back room of a small bar. This time, the mood was darker, more charged. The threats against Thompson had emboldened some but unsettled others. "This is getting out of hand, Reynolds," Daniel said, his voice low. "Throwing rocks. Leaving notes. If this blows up, we'll all go down for it." Reynolds shot him a glare. "Relax. The notes were just to scare him. He needs to know he's not welcome here. And it's working. Look how tense he's gotten." One of the younger officers, a man named Connors, leaned in. "But what if he doesn't back down? What's the plan then?" Reynolds' smirk faded, replaced by a colder, more calculating look. "Then we turn up the heat. Thompson thinks he can come in here and tear us apart, but he's about to find out how wrong he is." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I didn't sign up for this. You want to play games with Thompson, fine, but count me out." Reynolds grabbed his arm, his grip like a vice. "You're in this as deep as the rest of us, Daniels. Don't forget that." Daniels yanked his arm free, glaring at Reynolds before storming out of the bar. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Back at the precinct, Thompson gathered his senior staff for a strategy meeting. The officers sat around a large table, their expressions ranging from concerned to resolute. "We're dealing with a coordinated effort to undermine this department," Thompson began. "The threats against me are just the tip of the iceberg. This is about more than me. It's about the future of this precinct and the trust of the community." Captain Harris spoke up. "Do you think Reynolds is behind the threats?" Thompson nodded. "I'd bet my badge on it. But we need proof. Rachel is digging into his history, and I want all of you to keep your eyes and ears open. Any whispers, any unusual behavior, report it to me immediately." Officer Martinez, the young recruit who had spoken up in support of Thompson during the training session, raised his hand. "Chief, I overheard something yesterday. A couple of officers were talking about Reynolds meeting with some of the others off-site. They didn't say much, but it sounded organized." Thompson's expression hardened. "Good work, Martinez. Keep listening, but don't put yourself at risk. This isn't just about rooting out bad behavior. It's about preventing something worse from happening." That evening, Thompson returned home, his senses on high alert. He parked his car and scanned the street before stepping inside. His house felt like a fortress now, every lock double-checked, every curtain drawn. He sat at his kitchen table, the evidence bags containing the threatening notes and rocks spread out before him. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Morgan. "Chief, we've got something," she said, her voice urgent. "I pulled phone records for Reynolds and his group. There are dozens of calls between him and Daniels in the last week, and last night, there was a call from an unknown number that lasted nearly an hour." "Anything to trace the unknown number?" Thompson asked. "Working on it," Morgan replied. "But there's more. I reviewed body cam footage from one of Reynolds' recent patrols. There's clear evidence of excessive force during a traffic stop. Combined with the complaints already on file, it's enough to bring him in for questioning." Thompson exhaled, a mix of relief and determination. "Good. Issue the summons. I want him in my office first thing tomorrow morning." The next day, the precinct was electric with tension as Reynolds was escorted into Thompson's office. He entered with a cocky grin, but the defiance in his eyes betrayed his awareness of the situation's gravity. "Take a seat," Thompson said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Reynolds sat, folding his arms across his chest. "Care to explain this?" Thompson asked, sliding a copy of the body cam footage complaint across the desk. Reynolds barely glanced at it. "Looks like standard procedure to me." "Standard procedure doesn't involve slamming a civilian against a car for asking a question," Thompson replied, his tone ice-cold. "This is just one of several incidents on your record, Reynolds. You've been given chance after chance, and you've squandered every one." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You've got a personal vendetta against me, Chief. That's all this is." Thompson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "A vendetta? No. This is about accountability. And it's about to catch up with you." Before Reynolds could respond, Morgan entered the room, holding a file. "Chief, we've traced the unknown number from Reynolds' call last night. It's linked to a known agitator, a man with ties to extremist groups." Reynolds' smirk faltered for the first time. Thompson's eyes locked on him, the room crackling with tension. "Care to explain that, officer?" Thompson asked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Reynolds said nothing, but the defiance in his eyes began to waver. For the first time, he realized just how cornered he truly was. The precinct felt like a pressure cooker as news of Reynolds' interrogation spread. Officers whispered in the hallways, their conversations laced with fear and curiosity. The once unshakable confidence of the old guard was now tinged with doubt. Everyone could feel the shift. Chief Thompson was closing in, and Reynolds was running out of moves. Inside Thompson's office, the tension was palpable. Reynolds sat stiffly in his chair, his bravado slipping away under Thompson's unyielding gaze. Rachel Morgan stood to the side, holding a thick file that seemed heavier with each passing second. "Officer Reynolds," Thompson began, his voice steady but edged with steel, "this is your last chance to come clean. We have your call logs, your connections, and a growing list of complaints against you. If you cooperate now, you might salvage what's left of your career. If not, I'll make sure you never wear a badge again." Reynolds' jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Thompson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "That unknown number you called last night? We traced it to a man named Roger Maddox. He's on multiple watch lists for his involvement with extremist groups. Care to explain why you're in contact with someone like him?" Reynolds finally broke his silence, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I don't know anything about Maddox. It was a wrong number." Morgan stepped forward, opening the file. "A wrong number? Then explain the 45-minute conversation. Explain why Maddox has been flagged for anti-police rhetoric and violent behavior, yet you've been in regular contact with him." Reynolds' smirk was gone now, replaced by a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. "I don't have to explain anything. You're just looking for a reason to pin this on me." Thompson stood, his towering presence dominating the room. "Reynolds, you're not the victim here. You've spent years abusing your position, and now it's caught up to you. If you won't cooperate, I'll let internal affairs handle this. But make no mistake, you're done in this department." As Reynolds opened his mouth to protest, Morgan placed another document on the desk. "Chief, we've got something else." A witness has come forward, claiming Reynolds and his group have been meeting off-site to discuss ways to undermine your leadership. Reynolds shot to his feet. This is a setup. I've done nothing wrong. Thompson's voice cut through the room like a knife. Sit down, officer. Reynolds hesitated, his fists clenched, before sinking back into his chair. I'm placing you on immediate suspension pending a full investigation, Thompson said. Turn in your badge and your weapon before you leave this building. Reynolds' face twisted with rage, but he had no choice. He stood slowly, removed his badge and gun, and placed them on the desk. Without another word, he stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. In the hallway, the officers watched as Reynolds marched to the exit, his face a mask of fury. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others whispered quietly. Officer Martinez, standing near the corner, caught Thompson's eye as he stepped out of his office. "Chief, what now?" Martinez asked. Thompson placed a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Now, we rebuild. But first, we make sure no one else in this department is following Reynolds' lead." Later that evening, Thompson sat in his office, reviewing the growing file on Reynolds and his associates. The more he uncovered, the more insidious the web of corruption became. It wasn't just about bias or misconduct. It was about power, control, and a refusal to change. His phone buzzed. It was Morgan again. "Chief, we've confirmed Maddox's connection to Reynolds. Maddox has been funding a small network of officers resistant to reforms. We believe they were planning to escalate their threats." Thompson's grip tightened on the phone. "Escalate how?" "We're still piecing it together, but it looks like they were planning a public confrontation. Something to discredit you and force your resignation." Thompson exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "Do we have enough to arrest Maddox?" "Not yet," Morgan said. "But we're close. I've got a team tracking his movements. If he makes a mistake, we'll be ready." That night, Thompson returned home, his senses heightened. He double-checked every lock and closed every blind. His house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a target. As he sat in his living room, the events of the day played on a loop in his mind. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence. Thompson froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. To his surprise, it was Daniels. Thompson opened the door slightly, his eyes wary. "Daniels, what are you doing here?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "Chief, I need to talk." "It's important." Thompson opened the door wider, letting him in. "You've got 5 minutes." Daniels glanced around nervously before speaking. "I can't be part of this anymore. Reynolds is out of control. He's planning something big, and I'm afraid someone's going to get hurt." Thompson's expression darkened. "What's he planning?" Daniels hesitated, then said, "He's meeting with Maddox tomorrow night. They're talking about staging a protest, something violent. They want to frame it as community unrest, but it's a setup. They're hoping it'll force the department to pull you out." Thompson's jaw tightened. "Where's the meeting?" Daniels handed him a slip of paper. "An abandoned warehouse on the edge of town." "I'm done with this, Chief. I just want to do my job and go home." Thompson nodded. "You've done the right thing, Daniels. But you need to be ready to testify if this goes to court." Daniels nodded reluctantly. "If it comes to that, I will." As Daniels left, Thompson stared at the slip of paper in his hand. The confrontation he'd been preparing for was coming sooner than expected. The air was cold and still as Chief Thompson parked his car a block away from the abandoned warehouse. He'd chosen a nondescript sedan, leaving his official vehicle behind to avoid tipping anyone off. Rachel Morgan and a small team from Internal Affairs were already in position, surveilling the area from an unmarked van. "This is where it all comes together," Morgan said through Thompson's earpiece. "Reynolds and Maddox are inside. We've got audio confirmation. They're finalizing their plan." Thompson took a deep breath, steadying his resolve. He'd spent his entire career fighting against corruption and abuse, but tonight felt different. It wasn't just about the department anymore, it was personal. Inside the warehouse, Reynolds paced back and forth, his frustration spilling into every movement. Maddox, a wiry man with sharp features and a sinister calmness, leaned against a table covered in maps and documents. "This has to be big," Reynolds said, his voice tense. "If we don't shake things up, Thompson wins." Maddox smirked. Relax. Once the protest starts, the chaos will speak for itself. The media will eat it up, and your precious chief will have no choice but to resign. Reynolds nodded, though his nerves were evident. And what about afterward? What happens when the heat comes down on us? Maddox's expression darkened. You're not in this for the long game, are you? This is about sending a message, making it clear that people like Thompson can't waltz in and change the rules. The fallout doesn't matter. What matters is that we set the precedent. Outside, Thompson and Morgan listened to the live feed from the hidden microphone planted by an undercover operative earlier that day. Every word confirmed what they'd feared. Reynolds and Maddox weren't just resisting change, they were prepared to incite violence to maintain their grip on power. Do we move now? Morgan asked. Not yet, Thompson replied. We need them to explicitly outline their plan. The more evidence we have, the stronger the case. Suddenly, one of the operatives whispered through the comms. They're pulling out something from the back, a crate. Looks like weapons. Thompson's heart sank. This wasn't just a setup for a protest, it was a powder keg waiting to explode. Inside, Maddox opened the crate, revealing an array of Molotov cocktails and other improvised weapons. Reynolds' eyes widened, but he didn't back down. This wasn't part of the plan, Reynolds said, his voice shaking slightly. It is now, Maddox replied coldly. You want impact. This is how you get it. The moment these go off, everyone will turn on Thompson. They'll blame him for losing control of the department. Reynolds hesitated, but his desperation outweighed his caution. He nodded reluctantly. Fine. Let's do it. That was the moment Thompson had been waiting for. Move in, he commanded. Within seconds, the team from Internal Affairs and local SWAT units swarmed the warehouse. The air filled with the sound of shouting, boots pounding against the concrete, and the metallic clink of handcuffs snapping shut. Hands where I can see them, Morgan shouted, her weapon trained on Maddox. Reynolds froze, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. You set me up, he yelled at Maddox as officers closed in on them. No, Reynolds, Thompson said, stepping into the warehouse. You set yourself up the moment you decided this was the way to fight change. Reynolds glared at Thompson, his defiance flickering one last time. You think you've won? You'll never change this place. People like you don't last. Thompson stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. We'll see about that. But tonight you're done. Over the next several hours, the warehouse was processed as a crime scene. Weapons, documents, and recordings from the sting operation provided overwhelming evidence against Reynolds, Maddox, and their associates. By morning, news of the arrests had spread, shaking the precinct to its core. In the days that followed, Thompson addressed the community in a public forum. The tension in the room was palpable, but Thompson's presence commanded attention. The actions of a few do not define this department, he began. What happened here is unacceptable, but it's not the end of the story. Together, we're going to rebuild trust, accountability, and respect. It won't be easy, but I promise you, we will get there. The crowd erupted in applause, a sign that despite the turmoil, hope remained. Back at the precinct, Thompson called a meeting with his officers. The room was quieter than usual, but there was a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. I know the last few weeks have been difficult, Thompson said. But this is our chance to start fresh. To be the kind of department this community deserves. It won't happen overnight, but if we're committed, we can make it work. Officer Martinez raised his hand. Chief, we're with you. Let's do this. Thompson smiled, nodding. Let's do this. As the camera fades to black, the story concludes with a message. Change is never easy, but it starts with those brave enough to confront what's wrong and fight for what's right. What did you think of the ending? Did Chief Thompson handle things the right way? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.